In this video, we're going to play another bot. I'm thinking we're going to go with Janj, a 700 bot opponent, but I want to focus on development and castling relatively early in the game. So obviously development first, and then castling, and if we can do that within the first 6 to 8 moves of the game, I think that would be pretty ideal. So let's see how we do. And by the way, hi, this is Ralph for the Prineville Chess Club. Now, I've got this set for this bot opponent. I'm going to choose a random side, so I don't know if I'm going to end up with white or black. Let me go ahead and start the game. And it looks like we have white. And with white, I want to take center control, and I also want to make a move that's going to help me to develop early. So pawn to e4 is a kind of a nice move. It opens up a passageway for the bishop to come out. Even though the bishop can come out here in this second move, it's pretty common, knights before bishops. Not always the rule, but that's a pretty common rule that I'm going to follow here. I'm going to go ahead and develop my kingside knight. Now I'm focusing on my kingside for a couple of reasons. One, this kingside development helps me attack a pawn that was open, and it also helps to free up the spaces in between my king and my rook. And if I can get the pieces from between the king and the rook, I can castle. I can castle queenside, a little bit less common, but there's 3 pieces for me to move if I want to castle queenside, whereas there are only 2 pieces for me to move if I want to castle kingside. So that seems the more efficient way to go. So I was attacking this pawn on e5, and my opponent, she developed her knight, which protects the pawn on d5. I'm going to continue developing. I want to bring this bishop out. Now I've got a couple of popular options. Can bring the bishop over here to b5. That's referred to as the Ruy Lopez or Spanish opening. But I'm going to drop it here on c4, which is the Italian game. A nice thing about bringing the bishop here to c4, besides developing it, which is part of our ultimate goal, is it also lines up and targets this pawn right next to the black king. So we're doing pretty well here, and black is opposing me in a very similar fashion. At this point, I could castle. We're only 3 moves in, so on my 4th move, white could end up castling here, meaning I bring my king over to g1, and the rook goes opposing that, and that would put my king in a relative area of safety. However, I'm not going to castle right now. Even though I could, I'm not going to castle quite yet because my king isn't really at risk. There is a bishop targeting this pawn, but I still feel okay about that. So I'm going to try to develop a little bit more and grab a little bit more central space. And I'm going to do this in kind of an unusual way. I'm going to bring my c-pawn forward. Now the c-pawn targets these 2 adjacent or angled pieces or squares, so that kind of has some intention there. All right, now black is pushing their f-pawn, targeting my e-pawn, and my e-pawn is currently undefended, so that's not necessarily a good thing for me. Let's see what I can do to remedy that. Now, of course, we can always ignore the problem, and sometimes ignoring the attack is a decent way to go. But I don't think ignoring the problem is good here. So we have options, of course. We can take, we can defend, and of course we could defend as well with the queen. Either of those things kind of work. Let's see. Now, if we take, the downside of that is we're giving up one of our central pawns, and black is still going to have both of their central pawns. So that kind of takes away some of our central control. This is a dilemma. thinking maybe push. By pushing this D pawn, it supports the E pawn and also gives room to my dark squared bishop to get out of the way. And it also gives room to ultimately my knight developing and getting out there. I'm trying to think if there's any tricks for castling now, so if we castle right away, they can take this pawn. I'm going to go ahead and support that pawn. And we'll check in the evaluation to see if that was a decent move. Oh, so black is going for a sacrifice, but I don't know if this sacrifice really has any merit. They took a pawn with their bishop. They're checking my king, so I do need to respond in some way. And it looks like the most practical way for me to respond is to just take. Now, when you do see your opponent sack a piece like this, don't be too quick to move because they could have a plan, something up their sleeve that seems a little bit scary. So if I take this, if my king takes this bishop, I am going to lose castling rights for sure because once the king moves, I can't castle. So that's a good argument. Maybe, Ralph, you should have castled a little bit earlier. But that's okay. Now, after I take here, their knight could move in and check. No, that's not even a checking square, and that's not even practical, so that's not even a viable move. Their queen could come down and check, but that's not viable either because my knight defends that checking square. So I think this is just a bad sacrifice by my bot opponent, so I'm going to take that. Now, this also brings up a concept which is relatively common, and it's called manual castling or castling by hand. So even though I lose the right to officially castle where I bring my king 2 squares over and bring my rook over automatically, I could do this as kind of a manual way, meaning I bring my rook over here and then my king down here. And I end up with the same position had I castled, but okay. But I do it by hand, so castling by hand. All right, there are 2 attackers on this E pawn, and I've only got 1 defender, which means they can start to take back. However, I'm really intrigued by black choosing not to castle. So I am going to add a defender to that middle pawn by bringing my rook all the way over. So kind of like castling by hand, but I'm going to bring my rook all the way over to E1, adding support to this E pawn. I don't think I'm too worried about that. I need to still develop. I'm going to develop my bishop, pinning the knight. The knight is pinned to the higher value piece, the queen, behind it. So the knight can't easily move. And I'm going to finish my castling by hand, putting my king on G1. This gets my king, by the way, out of this rook alignment, and I'm effectively where I would have been had I castled. So you can kind of make the case that, yes, I did officially castle by move 9. All right, now, perfect example here. I can safely take this pawn on D5 because the black knight is pinned. The black knight cannot move. Pinned pieces cannot move. Therefore, there is only 1 defender of this pawn, and it's the queen. And the queen doesn't want to take because I've got a pawn defending that. All right, they made a king move. That's a pretty random, risky move. And they have increased the importance of the pin on this knight by putting the king there. So now the knight is super pinned, and I think there is a term for that. I just can't remember what it is. But now the knight can't move at all because the king is behind there, and you can't intentionally put your king in check. All right, well, I guess let's get to it. Now I have some pretty interesting options here. This knight is free for the taking. This knight is undefended, and I don't see any reason why I shouldn't take it. nice thing about taking this knight too is that that was the only defender of this pawn, so that allows me to take that one. Let's see, they are threatening to take my bishop. I'm going to back this bishop up just to kind of keep it safe, maintain the pin. They could have moved this pawn forward, and then I would have been forced to move my bishop all the way back here to f2, but they didn't make that move. But now I can take a pawn with tempo. So I can take a pawn, attacking the rook they just moved, and now I can take another pawn with check. This is going to be a good move here, I think. So I can take, ooh, yeah. I'm going to take this pawn, and I'm checking with my knight. They're going after my bishop. By the way, this rook is free for the taking. Might as well take it. And I do have a forking opportunity. So forks are very common with knights, but you can fork with other pieces. You can fork with bishops, you can fork with queens, and you can fork with pawns. So I can push this pawn forward, and I'm forking the king and the knight. And the king can't take back because it's protected by my rook down here. So the king was forced to move away out of that check, and I could take for free this knight. However, I can do something else called an intermezzo, or in-between move. And an in-between move is just what it sounds like. It's something I can do before taking that at-risk piece, that hanging piece it's called. And by checking the king again, the king is forced to move away, which means I don't have to worry about the knight jumping out of danger. So the king moves back, but that's not a very good position because it's in line with my bishop. So my light squared bishop way up here in the corner that I was starting to forget about, I can take their bishop with check. And this game is not going very well for Janj. So let's see. Now the king has moved. Oh, this is going to be another one. This is called a discovered check. So the king has lined themselves up with my rook, which means I can move this pawn out of the way and check the king. And since I'm moving a piece out of the way and a check just appears, it's called a discovered check. You can have discovered checks, and you can also have discovered attacks. And discoveries are very, very good tactical moves in a chess game. And that just forced the king to move. Now the king, of course, could not take this pawn because it's still defended by the bishop over here. And we got to be getting pretty close to a way to checkmate this king, but I really do need pieces to checkmate the king. And even though I told you my focus was going to be on development and castling, I did ultimately castle by hand, but I have never developed my B knight over here. My rook is still in the corner. My rooks are not connected. My queen has not been developed off of its starting square. So this is a terrible demonstration of developing early. So I think I'm probably going to keep it out there, but I guess I'll have to focus on developing and castling, but take this lesson with a grain of salt. I did not develop very well in this demonstration. All right, I'm ready to get some pieces out though, so let's see. Let's go ahead and get my queen developed. And that's going to open up a checking potential right over here. They're going to offer a piece for free. I'll take it. Now it looks like I've got a pretty interesting way to capture my opponent's queen. So check this out. If I move my queen to d5, the king will be in check. The king cannot take my queen because it's defended by the bishop. So that means since the king can't take the checking piece, and it can't block the checking piece because there's no space in between, the only option it has is to move away from check. Well, if my queen is on d5, the king can't take it because it's protected by the bishop. The king can't move to the squares next to my queen. And, ooh, is this going to be checkmate? Oh, boy, I was thinking I was just going to be stealing or grabbing the queen, but it's going to end up being a checkmate. And this is the thought process we want to go with. When we check the king, can they escape? The king can't go to any of these squares I've just colored red. It can't go up here because my queen would be guarding that one. And it can't go to this square on e7 either because it is being guarded by a pawn and my knight. So the king will have no escaping squares. That's going to be a checkmate. All right, let's go and click the game review. All right, 81%. That's a B minus. I'll take that. And yeah, so I had a miss in there for sure. A miss is when there is a good opportunity for you to grab a piece or checkmate earlier than planned, but I failed to observe that. I failed to see it. So, yep, that is a miss. And this happens sometimes in these games where they're very one-sided. Your opponent's making lots of blunders, mistakes, bad moves, and things like that. And so it's easy to lose focus. Remember, that's a drawback to these bots. However, I don't want that to be an excuse for me, and I don't want it to be an excuse for you. If you're playing a bot, and you're playing a bot that is easy or well under your rating, you can still learn from this. There's still value at looking at the board and making the best move. So although my excuse is that, oh, it was so easy, I wasn't worried about winning, that doesn't take away our responsibility to look at a position and make the best move that we can find. And I failed to do that. So definitely, I still have things to learn, even when playing some bots and playing lower rated bots. And in fact, we can even see it a little bit in this chart. I don't have a steady upward trend. I was playing white, right? Yeah, I was playing white. We don't have a steady upward trend in this chart. I was doing pretty well, and then it dropped down because of a miss or a mistake or something like that. So I was on an upward trend, but then I gave away some of my advantage. So that's something I definitely want to see how I can learn from. Now, I don't like to do the start review option. You can't see it on the screen here because chess.com just makes it too easy to tell you what the best moves are. So I like to switch over to analysis mode. And I'm going to ignore the engine over here on the right. So my eye is not going to look at that engine. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the board. I'll look at the little icons that chess.com puts on the board, and I'm going to keep my eye on this evaluation bar over on the left. And I'm going to use my arrows on my keyboard in order to navigate through the move. So E4, book opening, very popular opening with E4, grabbing central space and starting development on the kingside. They respond, I bring the knight out, they respond, I bring the bishop out. This is the Italian game. They bring their bishop out, I bring the C3 pawn out to protect some squares. Still, these are all book moves. A book move is just an opening or a defense that is well documented, has been studied many, many times by regular players and pro players, and the moves are pretty researched, and you can practice these openings, these common book openings. Okay, then black does a first weird move, and I can see my white evaluation bar is really picking up here, so I've got a 1.5 advantage. That's basically saying you're up a pawn and a half, even though we haven't traded any pieces. I'm going to press my arrow key. And there's a miss right there. So that little miss prevented me from maintaining that advantage. My advantage dropped. I think I have a pretty good idea of what happened here because, yes, I moved this pawn forward, and I ignored taking. So I bet, remember, my eye is not looking at those engine lines over there. So I don't know what the engine moves are yet, but I'm gonna come up with my own better move, and then I'm going to check it with the engine moves to see if I was right or wrong and how I might have been wrong. So definitely taking this pawn is a free pawn. The only reason I didn't do that, or a reason I didn't do that, was, okay, I'm going to grab a pawn. I didn't want to give up one of my central pawns so easily, and I figured they could then push this pawn forward, which was going to make me move my knight. And I wasn't ready to move my knight. And of course, I was selling you on the fact that this video was going to be about development, and I was a little bit annoyed with myself that I'm not demonstrating good development by bringing out these queenside pieces, my knight and my bishop and my rook and all that fun stuff. So I would not be shocked if e takes f5 is the best engine move. Now, before I look over at those engine lines, though, I'm going to double check and see if there's something else that might have been interesting. Actually, I do see something else that could have been interesting. Maybe. So this is pretty common in some positions. I take with the knight. I take this pawn with the knight. They take back with their knight, which puts their bishop and their knight on these two squares. And then I push this pawn forward, forking those two pieces with a pawn. And that would give me up a pawn. So that's kind of an interesting idea. Granted, then they would have been able to take this pawn down here and stuff like that. So my candidate moves are e takes f5 or knight takes e5. I think either of those probably would have been better than my little d-pawn push. I'm going to look at the engine. Doesn't look like I was on it, so let's see. Bishop takes g8. Oh, wait. Oh. So they wanted me to grab that knight right away while it's back there. Okay. And by looking at these little evaluations, we can kind of see, okay, that would have definitely maintained that 1.5 advantage. Bishop takes g8. What's so great about bishop g8? Well, by taking this knight, let me focus on that one, they would have been forced to move their rook to take back. That would have taken away castling privileges for the black side on the king side, which means their king is going to be quite exposed. So if they take, and then I could start to bring in more attacking pieces. Okay, yeah, bishop takes, g8. Oh, then they're suggesting in between move, f takes e4, and moving on from there. Now the second best move was d4, and I didn't predict that one either. So let's clear these out. These were not part of my prediction, so I'm learning something new here. They said my best move was going to be d4, takes. That's not so bad. That still doesn't alleviate this pressure of f takes e4. And in fact, sure enough, in the engine line, f takes e4 is going to be their natural response to that. So in both of the top two engine lines, I was just going to have to be prepared for f takes e4 and then do something different after that. So that is how we learn from an analysis. That's how we can still learn from playing a lower rated bot opponent. So I don't like to overwhelm myself with too many different lessons, but I definitely see where they're going with these particular options. So the two key options, bishop takes knight. Go ahead and get that out of the way. I don't know if I'm a huge fan of that. However, I really do see the logic of this double pawn push, controlling in the center and just dealing with this pawn takes and having to move my knight as a separate course of action. Okay. I'm just going to kind of advance a little bit further. That was a blunder. And I just want to see if I've made any really big, obvious other issues. I'm just looking at the icons. Green check marks are okay. Green thumbs up are okay. So even if it's not the best move, if it's a good move or an okay move, I'm perfectly satisfied with that kind of stuff. I'm seeing stars and thumbs up. Things are looking good. My evaluation over here, by the way, is solid white, and it's way at the bottom. I guess you can just see that. It says M3, which means I have a mate in 3 at this option. Did I find the mate in 3? Mate in 2. I move my queen. Mate in 1. They move a rook, and then we did discover this mate in 1, right? Took a little bit of thought to make sure, but even if it wasn't a mate in 1, checking this and being able to grab a queen is certainly a good thing, or trade down pieces. Okay, so that was a pretty good game, and still some stuff to learn from that one. Hopefully you picked up a little bit of information. And although I didn't do really well at developing my queenside pieces in this game, I will try harder next time to develop early, castle early, and then start my attack. Take care.